it's not an ends justify the means. The means are everything. The how is everything. The what is important. But if we try to do the what in a way that destroys the relationships through the how, then I don't want any part of it. And I think that has been always been such a key part of the American experiment is people of goodwill and faith engaging in such a way that cared about the people that they were working with and cared about the collective rather than just the individual, the self-interest.
All right. I'm Laura Forcum, president of the Independent Center and a former marketing professor.
I'm Lauren Hall, professor of political science and author of the Substack, The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life.
This is We Made This Political, a podcast about making politics more about flourishing and less about power.
We talk about living together in families, communities, and as citizens, drawing from our backgrounds in psychology and political science, and as parents. We are absolutely thrilled this morning to be joined by Emma Addams. Laura's going to do a quick bio, and then we're going to jump right in with Emma.
Yeah. So welcome, Emma. Thanks so much for joining us. Emma is the co-executive director of Mormon Women for Ethical Government, a national organization mobilizing women of faith to be ambassadors of peace and advocates for ethical civic government. She brings a background in negotiation, nonprofit leadership, and community building to help everyday women speak up, lead with integrity, and strengthen democracy. Thank you, Emma, for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here.
That's awesome. I'm a political scientist, and I just absolutely love talking about ethical governance, so I'm very excited about this. So we'd just like to hear origin stories. So at what moment did you realize it's no longer okay to just be sort of like a concerned citizen and vote and do all the things that concerned citizens do? At what point did you think I need to build something, and what led you to Mormon Women for Ethical Government as the thing that you should build?
Yeah, so I had spent a lot of time. I lived in Omaha, Nebraska for about 11 years. And during that time there, my kids were young and I was busy raising, young children, and I was a piano teacher in the community. And it's just kind of part of Latter-day Saint ethos that you volunteer and you just kind of pitch in and help out where you can. And I got really involved in refugee resettlement. There's a huge population of refugees in Nebraska. In fact, at one point, it was the greatest number per capita in the U.S. And so I ended up helping resettle some Syrian families and some Afghan families, and they ended up just becoming like family to me. I mean, and it was just the most beautiful experience for my family to experience it. I mean, I got to take like my young elementary school to the airport to pick up an Afghan family, and I just really became we became embedded in each other's lives, and I helped them navigate, the system and figure out how to get doctor's appointments and all that sort of stuff. And I learned a lot more about the refugee process. And I literally saw the paperwork that they had to pay back the money for the flight that came over from their country. So for me, when there was a travel ban put on people from Muslim majority countries in 2017, that was the kind of the moment for me that became really personal, because I knew that these families had family that were in refugee camps and in their home countries, and I'd always been politically active, and I had always been a Republican who was pretty voted fairly regularly as a Republican, and it shifted my thinking a bit that day when I was like, wow, how could my party do this? And so MWAG, I actually didn't start it. It was this Facebook group of these women who had kind of a similar, different topics, but similar experience to me. And a friend added me to this group. And I mean, frankly, I'm a person of faith, obviously. I had been praying. I was like, what should I do? How should I use my time? And then this group was there, and it was started by a group of friends on Facebook, and they didn't tell each other to invite their friends. And within a week, there were 1,000, and within 4 weeks, there were 4,000. And then that was 9 years ago this week. And so every year since then has just been women just flocking to the organization and building it into something meaningful and powerful.
Oh, awesome. I'm already going to derail us, but I had similar. I did a little bit of work with No One Left Behind, which is the group that works with former interpreters.
Yes.
and Iraq. And so we did something similar. And this was actually before I converted to Catholicism. But, the Catholic Church does a ton with refugee resettlement. And so
Yes.
that's a huge thing that we focus on as well. But I think you're absolutely like those connections, like when you actually sit down with refugee families. And I just remember going to this one family we were helping to settle. It was actually a journalist and his wife and their 4 kids, or actually, I think that's 6 kids, but like 2 of them
Yeah.
were out of the house. Anyway, and and like they immediately welcomed us in with like, these bowls of like dates and nuts and like so much
so
like
familiar with
people
those
who
bowls
had
of dates
so
and nuts.
little are like just so like it was just such beautiful like
Mhm.
hospitality. And it wasn't what I loved about it is that it wasn't this like one-sided like charity of like,
Nope.
we are gonna come in and like help you get started. It was this really beautiful, like reciprocal gift. Uh and it's just like super powerful.
Oh, that resonates so deeply. In fact, sometimes I would joke, I'm like, okay, we're going over there, but it's going to take us 2 hours because we're going to be, but it was just like the gratitude and generosity
Yeah.
that was just coming. I agree. I approached it as a relationship, a
Mhm.
reciprocal relationship rather than a service opportunity. And it really transformed, honestly, my view of what service is. It changed me, frankly. So I
Mhm.
felt this obligation to do what I could to kind of enter into spaces where we could make systemic change that impacted our friends and families.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little more about what MWEG does exactly and like what its goals are and how they are practiced with your audience?
Yeah, so we really have a two-part mission, and the first part is pretty obvious from our name. So we actually do take positions and we advocate for ethical government in kind of 4 advocacy areas, immigration and refugees being one of them. That has been at
Mhm.
the heart issue for a lot of us. Um, and the environment or caring for creation, kind of from a theological standpoint, what does it look like to care for the earth? But we really, um, with both of those and all of our issues, everything about intersects with good government. So it could be, there might be a policy that, seems like the best policy, but if it's not like, done in a way that exercises good government, then we're going to hesitate or maybe take a closer look. And then the next area is family health and well-being. So we work a lot on things like child tax credit on the domestic side, and postpartum Medicaid expansion in states and things like that. And then in addition, as a people who have a global church and care about the whole earth, we also worked quite a bit on global health and foreign aid, and kind of thinking about if we care about people here, we need to care about people everywhere. And then the fourth
Mhm.
area, which is really the area I should have mentioned first because it undergirds everything we do, and that is our advancing democracy. So we're always thinking about everything we do through the lens of, is this helping build, a constitutional government? Is it following the Constitution? Is it doing good long term to our system? And that's the side of our work that gets the most attention because that's the most kind of
Mhm.
concrete, and you can show things for it. You can show calls and you can show letters and, opinion pieces. But really the majority of our work happens on the empowerment and development of women in the leadership.
Mhm.
So everything we do on the advocacy side, we decide to do based on, is it going to create opportunities for women to learn and grow and lead and get better at what they do and to become the type of people that we really want to be in the public sphere. And so we do media literacy, and we do what we call peacemaking from a faith perspective, which is really just conflict transformation. How do you have the actual skills that you need to engage in that?
Mhm.
And we also do a lot around political identity, which is going to be really something that I think both of you really would care about, right? It's less about, is my partisan identity like my main thing,
Mhm.
or is there something more principled about it? And then the other one is civic skills. So just the basic civic skills. And it's interesting because I saw in the comments someone talked about republic versus democracy. We actually wrote a whole piece for that. We actually use all those words. We use republic, we use democracy, we use constitutional, federalism. We're a cross-partisan group, so we take kind of
Mhm.
approach to that where we define all of them and we use them a little bit interchangeably. But for a short conversation, it's hard to get into those. So we try to
Yeah.
show that in our work that we have. So there's a piece on our website all about how we use those words.
I
Great.
love
Thank
what you
you.
said about the cross partisan aspect of it, because I think the Independent Center is sort of like in the same challenge, which is if you only think of yourself as politically engaged along partisan lines, people who are nonpartisan or independent are like, well, I guess there's nothing for me to do here. So it's interesting how how you guys are thinking about this. Could you say a little bit more about how you help people develop that identity so that they can engage politically? Because it's not just this mental model we have. We also kind of hear from media and elected officials that like, oh, okay, well, if you're political, it's through a party. And I think that can be really limiting.
It is so limiting. And so what happens, I think a big part of it is community. So we have this community that is cross-partisan. 40% of our members are Republican, 34 are Democrat, and 26 fall in that other category. And so you have this community of women who share a faith. So we share, so there's a trust there that we're all acting
Mhm.
in good faith. And so what that allows you to kind of see other political ideologies as being worthy of of interest and of being put forth. And so that is like the first step, is kind of recognizing the humanity in everyone else, and then recognizing that you
Mhm.
have shared principles and values that overarch or supersede those. And then what has happened over time, and I mean this has certainly happened to me, so I can speak about it personally, but I've seen it in other women, is over time, when you're living and working and breathing and interacting in spaces where you have those different kind of ideologies intersecting, your ideology becomes less defining to you, and you find the things, the
Mhm.
principles that we all share. And it just, the word that women use is freeing. It just feels more freeing. They feel like they can
Mhm.
be more who they are, and they feel less tied down to a party, a group that's telling them how to think. So they become free thinkers. They become, I think, also just more able to see the dignity in everyone else because they're
Mhm.
not seeing them through that lens of this label. But the
Mhm.
trick is, as you pointed out, like there are not a lot of mechanisms or pathways or on ramps to engage except for through those parties.
Mhm.
And so we're trying to change that by preparing these women and sending them out, into the world. I mean, they're choosing to go out and do work, and they're helping to create those pathways and those communities and those options, and hopefully kind of even change their own parties so that they're less kind of stuck in this us versus them and
Mhm.
of thinking.
Yeah, a very quick response to someone in the comments who asked us to clarify what we mean by a democracy versus a republic. I'm a political scientist, so when I describe this very briefly to my students, I actually can do like a multi-hour lecture on it. So I'm not going to do that right now. We are a constitutional democratic republic, and so what that means is that on the republic side, we elect people to represent us in representative bodies. So we don't vote typically directly for policies, although we do in some states ballot initiatives and certain kinds of progressive policies in areas like Washington and other places. Oregon, there's some. California, there's ballot initiatives and things like that. Wisconsin actually was one of the first states to do that work. But
And
we have a
Utah has it
republic.
too, actually, believe it or
And
not.
Utah, yeah.
Oh.
And actually, New York has started developing more ballot initiatives. There's really interesting. The political science research is pretty mixed on this, but we can talk about it later if there's interest. Um, but it's democratic because we vote for our representatives. So unlike, for example, an aristocratic republic where the representatives have their position because they are born into a specific space, we vote for our representatives, and so that's where the democratic piece becomes really critical. And that's where I think the work that you're doing, Emma, is so important, which is that like part of what we need for a democratic republic to function is people who are, we need people who are civically engaged, people who are educated enough to understand the issues, and people who have a deep, I do a lot of work in political theory and the sort of Burkean tradition. We need people who have a deep affection and love of their country so that they're willing
Mhm.
to do the work that is required of citizenship, which is actually, we ask a lot of citizens. We often don't think about it that way. Um, and then the final piece, I'll just throw this out there because I'm on a bit of uh, yeah, I'll get on a soapbox for a second. It's a
I love it.
constitutional democratic republic, right? Which means that all of our leadership, all of our representatives are bound by the Constitution, including voters themselves. So that is a very quick answer. But I want to get back to MWEG because I think that this faith, there's so much really wonderful work being done from organizations like Interfaith America
Yes.
and MWEG and others, where rather than seeing, I mean, I actually think it's kind of ironic that like for a long time, faith was a really firm dividing line. It was like the thing that we fought civil wars over. But
Mhm.
now that we have fractured really deeply along these polarized political lines, faith actually has an opportunity to bring us together, right? It actually helps us align, as you said, in ways that are not that are not purely partisan. And so I don't know if you have any like additional thoughts about like what is it like. So in terms of thinking about women of faith as ambassadors of peace, like what are some of those other unique strengths that faith provides when in like deeply polarized time like right now?
Yeah, and I think you really described it beautifully. And it's funny because at different times I've struggled to articulate this almost because it's just so a part of who I am. It's just so obvious to me. Sometimes you articulate the things better that you don't understand because you have to kind of grapple with them. For me, it's just like, duh. When has people of faith not been involved in the good work of moving our country towards, towards something better, towards it's been that way since the beginning, with our friends who came across to seeking religious freedom, it's certainly for my people, I don't think our religion could have started, Latter-day Saints could have started any other country. Like we are deeply dependent on the Constitution, right? And the rights and responsibilities that we all have to one another as a minority faith. It's really, really important. I think maybe the best way for me to talk about it authentically is talk about the peacemaking aspect of it. And I think, as Christian women, we have just, been embedded with from the very beginning of our lives, this ethos that we need to see every person as worthy of dignity. That's just everything. I mean, we have this song that we sing, I sang it to every one of my children from the day they were a baby, through the time they wouldn't let me put them to bed anymore, which is called I Am a Child of God. And the whole idea is that each person is a child of God. And when that is something that is just so deeply felt in your identity, then I think it really shifts how you engage in political sphere because everything kind of stems from that. And then attached to that is this ethos of what we call peacemaking. And it really, what our founders did is they took Dr. King's 6 principles of nonviolence and they adapted them for a Latter-day Saint audience. And and those have been something that we have talked about at MWAIT from the very beginning. And it's basically kind of a philosophical operationalization, I can't say the word to say, but of what it means to be a peacemaker in the public sphere. And those can, look like things like it's proactive and courageous. So this idea that peacemaking is not this neutral thing where you kind of hang out and hope everyone feels good, which I think sometimes that is seen as a weak word. It's seen as a word that, is passive, but that's not the case at all. So we're trying to push back against that. It tries to unify instead of divide is our second principle. It demands great tolerance for people and none for injustice, which is like the hardest one to figure out because how do you look at someone, right, and really love them, but just thoroughly and utterly disagree with them? Like it's possible to do both. This idea that human suffering is sacred, not for the sake of it, but because how it transforms. And then we choose love instead of hate. And then we believe that an ultimate peace is possible. So I think that last one is so interesting because everything that we're working for, it's not just about the here and now. I'm thinking about our souls, in our case, theologically, and the eternity. I'm thinking about what are the things that we're doing here in this life, on this earth, that then impact us beyond. So when engaging in politics, this also means that, under my watch, this organization is going to always try to make sure that we're doing things that allow the women participating in it and the people we're participating with to become better people. Like that matters to me as much as any sort of outcome. It's not an ends justify the means. The means are everything. The how is everything. The what is important. But if we try to do the what in a way that destroys the relationships through the how, then I don't want any part of it. And I think that has always been such a key part of the American experiment is people of goodwill and faith engaging in such a way that cared about the people that they were working with and cared about the collective rather than just the individual, the self-interest.
I've been thinking about that a lot lately. And I know I had to do like a lot of, Dr. King talked about sort of like the process of self-purification. Like before you go out to protest, like you need to make sure that your internal house is in order because it's really hard not to lash out. It's really hard not to respond with, to violence with violence, for example. But even on like a much more minimal level, I'm not at all comparing myself to Dr. King.
We all aspire.
On a much more minimal level, like I caught myself, like this was probably like, I don't know, probably started in like 2010 or whatever, like with the advent of like internet, like real internet kind of conversations and comment sections and all that stuff. Like I actually caught myself and I was like, wow, this is making me a worse person. Like I'm I'm more reactive. I'm more negative. I look at my fellow citizens worse. And actually, a lot of research shows that this is the case, that people's interactions online affect the way that they think about their fellow citizens, even though those are actually not representative. Like, they're not representative of like the beliefs that people have. And I see this from progressive friends who are like, well, I can see what Trump supporters are like, right? I read their comments and I'm like, but those aren't representative, right? And vice versa, right?
Yeah.
So I love your thinking that this is, because I think this applies whether you're a person of faith or not, right? Like,
I agree.
whatever you think happens in the afterlife, the question is, what kind of human being do you want to be in this moment? And so do you want to be a human being that is like, getting like short dopamine hits by owning people on the internet? Or do you want to be the kind of person who looks at your fellow citizen and sort of and experiences a deep love, like even when you disagree fundamentally with them? And so to me, that was really, I had to like pull myself back. Do you find yourself like, did you have to go through like a similar process?
Yes.
Maybe you started out better.
No. I think that anyone who kind of arrives as a fully baked kind of peacemaker is maybe is not telling the backstory, or they might be avoiding conflict rather than actually. Yeah, no, I certainly. I mean, I love interesting back and forth. I love digging deep. I have no problem kind of arguing or getting back and forth, but I have to be very thoughtful and careful about when I use. I did have a moment on Facebook, not more than just a moment, when I felt like I was using intellectual superiority to shut down well-meaning conversation, and it didn't feel good. Maybe it worked and that it scored some points and you got some likes, and which is one of the reasons why, I mean, we have a lot of spaces, including some on social media, and we try to do it differently. But it's one of the reasons why I try to be there, but I've moved away from it because the temptation to perform for those who are listening. So I guess I would flip that a little bit. So at one point it flipped for me, and I was like, there was a temptation to perform and win for those that, not to be owned on your own page, not to have someone outdo you intellectually. So I flipped that a little bit in my mind, and I'm like, I do want to perform on social media, but my performance is that I don't ever want anyone to ever leave a conversation with me feeling like I've made them feel like they're less, that I'm smarter than them. And that to me has become more important than winning anything. What has become important to me is any sort of conversations that are held in view of anyone else, especially, but hopefully you're a person who does this, across the board. I've wanted to have that conversation that people left and they feel like they were nourished by it, and that we understood each other better. And that's a very different way. And that does require, I mean, I have very, publicly told people I was wrong about this, and I feel like that's a strength that I feel like to say, oh, you've changed my mind about this, or thanks for bringing that to my attention. To me, that's an example of someone who's closer to kind of self-actualization, right? And I think that's a shift that you have to make, and it feels a little countercultural at times, but it's a beautiful place to be. If no one gets there and stays there all the time, right? We're all kind of tussling with this all the time because our egos jump out and we're like, no, but I was right. But if we can do more of that, I think we can be better, collectively.
Yeah. I also, I really appreciated Marcus's comment about people being heard as sort of like a precondition of arriving at that peace, and I think like that's true. We were talking about parenting before we started the podcast. And like, that's something that has kind of shocked me in my parenting experience, which is like how much peace I can just see between my children and I, if I will just hear their complaint. And it doesn't mean like, okay, now you don't have bedtime, or now we eat, the third serving of ice cream. It just means like hearing what they have to say. And I think that like we often fall into this trap, especially like in public discourse, where we're kind of expecting that like we could just start with the peace part, and let's start with the kind of niceness, I think, that you were talking about, Emma, that's like not real, right? And not authentic and not actually nourishing. And so, I feel like there really has to be this expectation that if you want other people to hear you, you also have to hear them. And that means like, really like deeply searching for the meaning that they're trying to share with you, rather than sort of saying, like you're not allowed to feel this way. Like I'm not even entertaining this. And the more polarized we get, I think the harder it is for us to like understand that there's a reciprocal need to listen and to hear as like that undergirding. Like peace can build on top of that. And it's really transformative.
Well, I've never had a conversation with someone where I didn't where I was curious and I didn't feel like I started to really understand. There was there's logic. You might enter a conversation like, I don't understand why they think the way they do.
Mhm.
And then you had curiosity onto that where you're starting to you kind of just listen to them. And the thing is, doesn't mean that you've come to agree with them. Like that's the big
Mhm.
misconception
Yeah.
is that you're supposed to then it's like appeasement, like you're agreeing, you're saying,
Mhm.
no, I agree with you. But understanding is just like a gift.
Mhm.
And from a tactical perspective, if you want to persuade someone, I mean, not to get strategic about it, you have to understand them. But if you go in trying to, the irony is if you go in trying to persuade them, you will actually be the least persuasive version of yourself. So if you want to be persuasive, you will take a step back and you will try to truly understand and be curious about what they say. And then the result of that is that the relationship of trust develops such that you could be more persuasive to each other. But
Mhm.
it's a beautiful thing. You have to try it to figure it out, and it
Mhm.
gets kind of messy, and you make some mistakes, but it's definitely worth the effort.
So, yeah. Um, so I think the one of the problems that I think a lot of the narrative that we just sort of laid out, which I completely agree with, and I think I've experienced and I'll say this, I am much more optimistic than most of my colleagues right now, and I think part of the reason that I'm more optimistic than most of my colleagues is that I spend a lot of time in spaces like this one. And I spend a lot of time talking to people from like across the political spectrum who who deeply care about the future of this country. And so if if you only spend time thinking about the other side, quote unquote, as like bad people who want to destroy our way of life, then yeah, it looks pretty bleak. But when you actually dig into like how people are actually working in the world and how people from different political beliefs are operating, it it I think is a really like it gives you a lot of hope and it gives me a lot of strength to like keep doing what we're doing. Um, on that note though, like how do you like I think one of the criticisms that I get a lot when I talk about my specific brand of like radical moderation is well, you're just falling into like sort of like both sidesism or this is just about like being nice to each other and like everything will work itself out. Like so how do we like I think part of what I try to emphasize is that this is like a radical kind of activity. Like it's like a really it's not easy. This isn't just like hey, we just ignore each other's differences and like pretend that they'll go away. But how do you think about communicating that to people? Like, how do you get around those criticisms that this is just like milk toast civil discourse, like
Mhm.
easy out? You're not holding people morally accountable, but you're also avoiding these really hard conversations.
Yeah, so I have to tell you, first of all, I used to call myself a fanatical moderate. So we're on the same page. So think the challenge with this is that you kind of have to get in and do it to understand it's not that, right?
Yeah.
And I think and you have to kind of figure your way through it. But you have to practice it. Like I'm a musician, a piano teacher,
Mhm.
by training. You got to get in there and you got to do it, and then you feel it transform you, and you're like, oh, this is so much more than I thought it was. I think, we get this criticism from people often. They're like, well, because we're nonpartisan and our membership is cross partisan. And we get, well, you guys aren't because you're not being neutral. And there's this idea that somehow you're either like always yelling or you're neutral. And there's like
Mhm.
not this space in between. And I think it really goes back to that principle of peacemaking that I talked about great tolerance for people and none for injustice. I mean, we say hard things all the time that regularly frustrate even our own members or our people in our community. But we just don't do it in a way that attacks people. And to me, that's kind of like the line that we draw. And so when we take a position, we know that it's going to frustrate and upset people, but we do it anyway
Mhm.
because we have like studied it out and we've debated and we've gone back and forth internally and we've felt morally compelled to and sometimes to do that. Um, so I'm a big proponent of courtesy. I'm a big proponent of kindness, but I don't think that kindness means like deflection or kind of pulling back. I think kindness
Mhm.
is truly allowing us to grapple together with our differences and to go back and forth and to disagree and to get a little heated, and then see if we can either come to agreement or not, or just kind of have that change us for the future so that maybe in the next conversation we've had, we're doing it a little bit better. And I just, yeah, this polar thing where you have to, if you don't believe this, then you must be this. I just reject it. I just reject it completely. I think the other way to look at it, and Manu, Neil, who runs Bridge USA, which is a college, campus group that's working on dialogue, he describes it as countercultural. And I like that. I'm like, we're actually being countercultural here. The dominant culture right now is this yelling at each other, missing each other, kind of tearing each other down. So we actually are doing something a bit radical in many ways by saying we refuse to participate in that. And so I think that allows you to take a little bit of pride and energy from the fact that you're pushing back against the norm. And also, but you're choosing to do it in a way that doesn't tear others down. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the way I look at it. That's where the stubbornness in me comes out. Is like, I'm not going to allow it to turn me into that.
Yeah. I actually just read or listened to this great podcast with Sister Helen Prejean, who wrote the book Dead Man Walking, and she was on the spiritual life this week or last week. And it was a really great episode. But one of the things that I think we often sort of underestimate is how much of this is structural. So she tells the story of the first time that she showed up at to support. It was at the pardon hearing for this man who had done terrible things, like admittedly terrible things. In the court, the way that the court was split up is that you had to split up it, whether you were on the victim side or the convicted man's side. And so she sat on the convicted man's side because she was his spiritual advisor. And she said even that it tricked her into thinking that there were sides. She actually felt like she couldn't talk to the victims' families. And it was this, one of the victims' fathers, Lloyd LeBlanc, actually changed her attitude toward that. He said, "Why didn't you ever come and talk to me?" And she said, I was scared. I was worried. I didn't know if I would be welcome. And I think one of the things that her story is so beautifully represents is that, like, choosing a side often prevents us from really standing for what we care about. And in her position, she said, "I'm not pro-victim or pro-criminal. Like, that's not what I'm here for. I'm pro-human dignity," right? And so I stand for the dignity of the convicted, and I stand for the dignity of the victims. And her goal is a world in which we recognize that human dignity in everyone. And I just thought her, seeing someone like her who has obviously had such an incredibly powerful life, and her recognition that, like, the structure tricked her, like that these sort of structural barriers, the way that we are like split into sides, can be really, really powerful because the human brain is kind of set up to fall into those traps. Laura and I talk about that a lot, but are there structures like that you see in your work? I mean, obviously, like the party system is like a perfect example of this, but are there other ones that you've had to push back against?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'll even pivot a little bit to talk about skills, because I think I think you're right. I think we're working against a lot of structural factors that kind of force us into this, and to me, oftentimes the way to kind of get past that is to equip people with skills that they can then practice, that then kind of overcome some of those structural barriers. So, when we first started this work, I read you those beautiful peacemaking principles we have. We've read the New Testament, and since, we were babies, and so we understand that kind of on a cellular level, that what this means on a philosophical level. But a year or so into this, I was like, but do we actually have the skills to operationalize that? Because it's one thing to believe it, it's another thing to actually do it, because it's a really hard thing that's being asked of us. So we started a whole series called Practical. We call it Practical Peacemaking, and that's evolved into now Conflict Transformation, where we kind of walk women through just like the actual practical, what does it look like to not just like tolerate conflict, but how can you become a type of person who feels equipped and confident enough to actually walk into complex situations and actively pursue transformation?
Yeah.
And, that a lot of that involves some really deep work. You have to first figure out what kind of a conflict, am I an avoider? Am I an accommodator? Am I a competitor? Like, what is my natural state there? And then kind of basically I describe it as increasing your suite of skills or tools in your tool belt, right? And so maybe your natural stance is to accommodate or avoid. So why don't you try out some of this where you push a little bit more? Like, let's give you some practical ways to do that. And the cool thing is we started this work, hope the whole goal initially was to help women prepare for meetings with legislators, right? How can you, if they come at you with something, and so they came for that, and then they kept coming back because they were like, this is helping make my marriage better. I'm doing a better job with my teenager. And so I love the sort of skills building and philosophy that then become like whole system, like whole person, because you're more likely to utilize it if it becomes who you are and less just like a tactic to be used when you try to get something you want. And so I am convinced, I mean, part of this is kind of coming from a little bit more of a conservative background where oftentimes you kind of go back to the the values and the nature of the people doing it, right? And you're trying to think about how we want to change systems, you have to change people, and then the people transform the systems. And I now have a more balanced view. You kind of have to do both. And so, we do support things as an organization like the Building Civic Bridges Act and legislation and structural things that help incentivize. And we're working on some open primaries in places. So there are all sorts of kind of structural things that we think can help, elevate and bring that. But I think you have to do both. You also have to give people the muscle, the training, and build the muscle to do it so that, when and if we can kind of help. Also, even if we can't change some of these structural things, at least we can put the people into the system who can do better than it's currently being done.
I love that skills framing because I think we're all so we tend to default into this view of like you can either do something or you can't, and if it's hard, you can't do it. And there's so many areas of life where if you think about it as like I can't do it yet, right? And like what is the scaffolding that I need to be able to do this thing? And acknowledging that it's hard, but it's also learnable and practicable, just like opens up a lot of possibility, I think.
And is that not parenting right there? What you just described?
Yeah, exactly.
Every day. I mean, right?
Yeah,
Exactly the
exactly.
nature of we do as mothers, right?
Well, can you talk a little bit about that? About like, has your work with MWEG changed your parenting practices? Did your parenting practices like affect how you thought about the work that MWEG does?
Yeah, and for me, it's kind of dual. Like, as a musician and a piano teacher, I've taught like hundreds of kids over the years. So I have all these kids that aren't my own kids that I've, you don't come to the piano knowing how to play it, and it's amazing what they can do over a period of time. So I think one of the things that I often say is that parenting has got, and everyone parents under difficult circumstances, right? I mean, there's different kids are different. Every child is different. But one of the skills and one of the gifts of parenting for me has been that you can come at me with so much anger that I'm going to be the calmest person in the room. I've just had years and years of toddlers and babies, and I used to host like all the preschool kids in the neighborhood. We were always a home where there were just lots of kids in our house. And because of my piano students too, it was just always a hub for kids. And so lots of experience with conflict and helping them negotiate it. But then also with my own children, as is always the case, as the mother, you're in the safest place. So you bear the brunt of all of the frustration and anger. And so that has just been the biggest gift when it comes to politics is because, generally speaking, if I'm not sleeping, I'm not eating, I'm not taking care of myself, it's harder to remain kind of a force for stability. But generally speaking, you can throw something at me and I've had worse before. And so I am able, you know what I mean? So I'm able to just like maintain a sense of, calm is like not the right word, but it's just like I can stay centered even when everything around me is chaotic. And that has been the biggest gift for my work. Just huge because it is chaotic and people are upset a lot and there's just emotions. And so that really makes a huge difference. And then I think, going back to the skills building, that so matters, as we watch our children grow and develop into something that is extraordinary, but we were with them from the beginning when it was, and I have some young adult children now and there. Oh my goodness. It's amazing to watch them just become these humans who are just doing these things I frankly wasn't sure they'd ever be able to do. And so you have that advantage, right? Of being able to see growth and development. And you give people grace because everyone grows and develops. And so you treat, I hope that we treat everyone as potential. You have possibilities. So those are a couple things. I'm sure there are many others that you guys have. And we could talk about this probably for like all day long because it's such an
Yeah.
important book. But it's a gift. We need moms, we need women, we need parents in the
Yeah.
public sphere.
Yeah. So it's funny. I was thinking about this the other day. Like, I feel like the entire nation needs like some deep, like cognitive behavioral therapy, but we have
Oh my gosh,
like a
amen.
very euphemistically called a spirited child. And so we started doing, some cognitive behavioral therapy with her because there was a lot of like anxiety, but also a lot of
Yes.
really rigid. She's a very rigid thinker. And so like she has a conception of justice and it's the only conception of justice that matters. And so but one of the things that was really beautiful, like over the course of the last few months, is that we have a wonderful therapist, and one of the things that she started doing, which was it was very subtle, and I really liked it when I realized what was happening. Though, is that she would say, "Okay, well, let's talk." So at the end, she would sort of pull my husband and I aside, or whoever, and talk to us a little bit about strategies. And then I realized I was like, "Oh, she's doing it to us too." Like, because so much of what we see in both parenting and politics are these vicious cycles, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm angry because you're angry, right? Like you, internet commenter, or whoever.
You made me angry.
You made me angry, and now I'm going to lash out. And so these vicious cycles are really, really hard to cut short. And so one of the things that we have to do as parents, right, is learn not to react. And as Laura mentioned before, I think this was before we went live, it doesn't mean that you let your kid get away with stuff, but it means that you have to be that anchor for them because their emotions are going nuts. They're doing, but they can really easily trigger your emotion. And so the same thing is true, obviously, in the political space, right? And so a lot of the skills that we've learned, the therapist gave us like a big binder for us to help so that I can like sort of hand it to my daughter and help her, like if she would like to choose a strategy that you'd like to think about today or whatever. Like, and I'll find myself like flipping through, like, but I think like recognizing that this is just like, it's the human condition. Like we all make very similar kinds of errors. We all have very similar, like we're all triggered in kind of similar ways. Like we have different levels of like some people are much more easily triggered than others. But I think it's work that we all have to do, and it's like ongoing work, But yeah, it's been really, really eye opening, and so I wouldn't recommend like a spirited kid if you want like a calm life, but it helps with like a lot of personal.
It ends up being a gift. No, I agree. Well, and then maybe, I mean, we went tactical because I always tend to go tactical. But I think the other thing about, for me, motherhood and politics is that it's helped me think about other people's children. So this level of care and protection and that I feel for my own children, working in politics and working in advocacy has helped me transfer, I think, a lot of that goodness and experience I have, not just protecting, but caring for lives other than my own and bearing them, right, and birthing them means that my connection to my refugee children's friends and children across the country and children in different places and in my community who may or may not have access to the same resources and stability that my own family has really been the thing that pushes me and guides me towards a lot of the policy that we work on as other people's children, and they should matter as much. To me, they matter to someone. They matter to a mother and a father. They matter to, and so that is, I think, a beautiful part of motherhood and politics is that you can bring that care and commitment.
That's really beautiful.
So on a harder note, last week we had Shannon Watson, Majority in the Middle, on. She's in Minnesota, and Utah obviously has dealt with its own unrest after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And I don't think any of us think about like Minnesota and Utah as places that we would see political violence. This isn't a norm for our country. Do you does MWEG think about I'm sure you do think about the problem of political violence, but how are you all thinking about this as tensions seem to be escalating? And how can we think about this just broadly speaking, both within the context of that sort of care, right? The need to do that self-regulation, but also in terms of like what structures do you think are contributing to that and how can we challenge them?
Yeah. So when when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, he was assassinated, at this university where we have our conference every year. And we had lots of members there and leaders who were actually there on campus. So, and, I got the text within like 3 minutes from one of my leaders whose son was in high school, was across the street at McDonald's, and people were rushing out. So it was deeply personal, obviously, because it's one thing to see it, have it somewhere else, but within your place. And so within a couple hours, what we did, and this, I'm going to tell you kind of what we did in the aftermath, because I think it provides a little bit of an example of how to have best practices going forward. So we assembled on a call, a group of bridge builders and peace builders. So there's multiple organizations that they're national, but they actually have their leaders who live in Utah. So Braver Angels and Living Room Conversation, Dignity Index, and then we have the Wheatley Institute at BYU, and then this group called Waymakers that's associated with some people at Utah State. So we kind of all came together, and we brought in someone who was kind of had international peace building and national peace building experience. And we had an initial call, and we're like, what are we going to do? And out of that, we decided to kind of form a little bit of a short-term coalition. And our first goal was we knew that in the aftermath of a violent act like that, you have this risk of having retaliatory and additional violence. And so the first goal was just, what can we do to basically outshine the conflict entrepreneurs in the public conversation? Like, can we flood the airwaves with messages that can kind of, you have to do 5, 10, 50 times as much in order to kind of outshine that. So we did an op-ed the next day. We put up a website within 48 hours. We did a press conference. And the goal was, as all the writing and all the reporting was happening around this, and it was kind of amping up and people were taking sides, and it was becoming this, it became like a referendum on if you think Charlie Kirk is a good guy or not guy. People were lining up, right? And so we just tried to basically create a whole different frame around this, which was, that we as Utahns, we condemn this. And here's some things that you can do in the aftermath, because we know this is discombobulating. And so that was within 48 hours, we had all that. And then we had assembled this group, and I felt like we were fairly successful along with so many others. And really we approached it from a grass tops and grassroots perspective, meaning we wanted to make sure leadership was strong and speaking out. And we were encouraging that and uplifting that as much as possible, and trying to kind of, again, outshine the conflict, the people who were opportunistic about this moment, who wanted to create more conflict. But then the other goal was to bring to bear all of the different constituencies we had. So we didn't want just the leaders to be talking about it. We wanted to help seed and support those conversations, those tough conversations that parents were having at home, around the dinner table, that people were having on their family group text chat, on their Facebook group, the PTO, whatever it was. And so we pulled together this website with all these resources about aftermath, but then also brought together events and resources about how to, kind of going back to our skills thing, use this as an opportunity to motivate and inspire people to get to really hone their conflict transformation skills. And so that has been, and then since then, we've been kind of working on operationalizing that long term, because it's one thing when you have something like what happened with Charlie Kirk. It's an ongoing problem. It exposes existing fractures. It's that have always been there, and it risks making those fractures more ruptured and more, and you risk having people divide themselves even more. And you have to work overtime to get that impulse, to kind of overcome that impulse. And so we kind of set up this thing. It's called turntoward.us. And so we've set up this project, and we're kind of working with these groups and with local groups to figure out, what does the long-term conversation look like here? And what did this expose about our community and our state and the fractures within, that we can help fix less, but more work towards empowering individuals to change over time. And so, there's been I attended a transformative mediation training. There's multiple versions of those happening across the state. Braver Angels has workshops, Dignity Index. And we're not competing with one another for whose workshop is the best. We're actually going in and saying, in this situation, what's the customized version of materials that you need? And let's work together to help this university or this school or this group get it. And then where are the gaps? Where are the communities, and some of this, the vulnerable communities, which are kind of have to be quiet and protect themselves during this time.
Yeah.
How can you have their voices be heard without exposing them to future vulnerability? So I really, and part of this is just going back to parenting, never let a good crisis go to waste. This is a learning experience, as an opportunity. I just really, and this is a faith thing too, I firmly believe that when bad things happen, it's not necessarily they were meant to be, but you can always take them and figure out some way to grow, learn, and do better. And this is one of those examples.
I love your language, right? Which was um, not outshout, not like,
Yes.
like it was outshine, right? You want to
Yeah.
outshine the conflict entrepreneurs. And um, I don't know if Amanda Ripley came up with that term, but Amanda Ripley's work, Good Conflict,
Yes.
is another organization that does really wonderful work. And for any of the listeners, they have tons of resources free resources on their website on conflict management and like sort of that internal how you can respond in times of high conflict. Her book is really great too.
Yeah.
Called, is it just High Conflict?
High conflict.
It is. Yeah. Such a good book.
But yeah, I loved two things about that. Like one was that phrasing, right, of outshine. And then the other thing is like the need to adapt the message for different audiences and different spaces, right? Because I think people like it's much different to have these conversations within like your church or your synagogue than it is in a university classroom, than it is in the public square. If you're at a local government, like a town board meeting or something, I think people really do have to take context really seriously. And so helping people context shift is really critical too. And it sounds like you guys are doing that.
Yeah, and I think that, the other thing that was so unique about this moment too is as we were getting together and kind of deciding, we were like, well, we all were going to put out our own statements or do our own iPads. Everyone was going to do it individually because we're all in the business of trying to build peace. But what would happen if we kind of dropped our egos and came together and just did it all together, right?
Sure.
And that's, I think, where it becomes powerful is that collaborative spirit, and then carrying that forward really matters. And in times violence fractures, it literally kills human lives, and that it fractures people, it fractures relationships. And so you have to work overtime to come in and help provide opportunities to rebuild. So it's a terrible thing. It's also an opportunity to do something better.
I keep trying to come back to too. Like I think whenever we're in these like highly polarized, like very fragile situations, sort of going back to first principles, like I wasn't sure how to respond to the Charlie Kirk killing, again, murder, assassination, like straight up, right?
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right that like some of the first conversations were like, well, was he a good person? And I was like, that's not the question. Like that's not the relevant question at all, right? The relevant question is whether humans have dignity and whether political violence violates deep commitments that we have to each other as we live in political communities. Like those are the critical questions, right? And so to me, it was helpful to sort of like, before I put anything out into the internet, I can't even remember if I did, because there's like another question, like, am I the right person to be saying anything at all? Probably not,
Totally.
right? But so there's that question, like, should you say anything? But then also, like, what is the message I want to be out there? And for me, it's really important that I pause. And I'm not a pauser, but like
a woman of action.
I tend to jump in, and so that has been really important to me, is like just that like restraint. Like, wait a second, what is the really critical message here? And it is like, that human. I go back to human dignity. Other people have different first principles that they go back to, and that's fine. But I think it's really important that you have one. Because otherwise you can just, if you don't have an anchor, you are just going to be buffeted about,
I think for a lot of people that defining principle has become that the other side is bad or the other side has to be stopped. And I'm with both of you, I share like my first principles also that all humans are deserving of dignity. And it's also like, it's a faith-based view for me too. They're all made in the image of God. And it's like, it's a really helpful grounding. It's also a really challenging grounding because, there are moments when it's easier to not start there, right? There are times where it's really hard to acknowledge that dignity. And that like, in the Episcopalian Church, we call them image bearers. So and we also call them our brothers and sisters, our siblings.
Yes.
And to me, like, that's very, if you start with that, right, like it's a very different conversation that you're having about policy disagreements, right? Rather than, or even political disagreements. So I think like that's such a great challenge to people who are listening to the podcast. Like, what is your grounding principle? Like, if you're looking for a way to get more involved civically, that's a great place to start. Like, what is my first principle?
Mm, I love that.
By the way, and we are all women of faith. I am a much more recent woman of faith, but for because I'm sure that we have people who are not coming at this from a faith perspective as listeners, and I think it's really important to emphasize that like this does not have to be faith based at all. When I talk to my undergrads, um, way back in the day, right? Like, what are the sort of like universal laws that undergird human political life, right? And one of the things I had them do is a thought experiment of like, what are the rules that like have to exist if political communities are to exist? Like, what are the rules that you can't allow to be broken?
Yeah.
And one of them was, you know, indiscriminate killing. Like you cannot allow murder. You cannot allow that kind of violence because it inherently fractures human communities. So whether you believe in God or not, like there's a natural logic to certain kinds of political rules that I think we can point to that has nothing to do with a creator. It doesn't require you to believe in a creator. But I think to Laura's point, it's really important that people have something that they can point to. Like, what is the line in the sand that you can point back to, or that you simply won't cross? And again, it doesn't have to be rooted in an omnipotent God or scripture. It can simply be rooted in what humans need to flourish in community with one another, and that's there's a remarkable amount of, I say this is an Aristotelian, right? Like there's a remarkable consistency across human social world because humans need specific things to live together, right?
Oh, I love that. I
So
love that. Yep. I think you could also look to the Constitution, and there's so much there. It's just, I mean, like I definitely grew up in a household that had kind of almost like a reverence for that, that work. And as the more I do the work I do, the more I literally have one right here and I have one in my bag. And I just keep coming back to it all the time because I do see it as a really extraordinary, imperfect document because it's made by humans, right? Always want to acknowledge that. But like the amount of stuff that's there that continues to hold how we understand the rule of law. I mean, due process, like I think all these things, freedom of speech, all these freedom of religion, like all of these things that are enshrined in that. We can argue about the operas, how they're systemized, but the core principles are worthy of support across all Americans.
And I think too, what's really remarkable about the Constitution was that like it was a standard that people decided we should hold ourselves to, even though in that moment our understanding of what it meant for all humans to have these inalienable rights, like it was we had an imperfect understanding when those words were written. And we continue, I think, to grow in our understanding of what that looks like and what it means and how we operationalize it. And so I think like rather than looking at that as an example of like our failure, right? Like it's an invitation to continue to push ourselves towards something that you started out acknowledging, Emma, is just like incredibly challenging.
Well, I love like Dr. King in his last speech talks about the words on the paper. It's like if we hold ourselves to the standards of the words on the paper, then what I'm asking you to do is consistent, right? And so I just think it's just been this march towards that. And we have setbacks and we mess up, but we just have to keep doing it. It's just it's everything.
one of the I'd strongly recommend, because we're now entering the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," is one of the most powerful. He did it in right outside of my hometown, Rochester, New York. I believe he was at Seneca Falls. And he purposely did it on July 5th. He was like, this is like a very specific choice of date. But I strongly recommend everyone read it because it's the exact same thing that you just mentioned, that Dr. King echoed, right? Which is like, this is a promise. It's an expression of principles. Nobody at the time claimed that they were doing it 100%, right? It was an ideal that was meant to shape the way that we think about our political communities. It was not it was not like done. Here we go, like we're there. So we like to end with all of our guests with just questions of what you feel optimistic about right now. There's a lot to obviously be pessimistic about. So we would love to just hear from you. Like what are you or MWAG or how are you all thinking about feeling optimistic during a tough time?
Yeah. So maybe I'll do a quick personal and professional. So
Yeah.
I have a started child and you know, he is just blossoming and blooming and growing and doing things that I never imagined. And I think the struggle that we had along the way is kind of what makes it almost more exceptional now.
Mhm.
And to watch him grow into himself and who he is, again, just helps me really drives home the capacity of human development, human spirit that I believe that we're all capable of. And it's just it's a wonderful experience as a parent to watch that and to watch him do things that I never thought of his own accord. He's pushing himself to do just completely, agency driven. I think on the professional side, this is a pretty regular occurrence. I mean, I know there's a lot to be distressed about, but I feel like it's a privilege to be doing the work I do because even though it requires me to keep up with the news and everything, it also gives me something to keep my hands busy and my brain working and my heart, always pumping. And we have, I mean, MWAIC has these thousands of members across the US, and it's a regular occurrence that I think, oh, I would like to write an op-ed about this or that, or I have an idea and I just don't get to it. But then I wake up and someone else has published it or written it. And I think there's nothing better. I mean, there's nothing better than watching other people grow and develop and become empowered and find their voice. And so I think, you know, you see this tough stuff happening, and then you see the human spirit popping up in response, and it doesn't negate, right? I think when you come down to it, my co-executive director, Jen, talks about this quite a bit, and it comes from John Paul Lederach, who's a real extraordinary peace builder, and talks about the moral imagination of peace building. And it involves really, the first thing is you have to be able to look you have to be able to look the destruction and the horror and everything in its face. You have to be realistic about what it is. You have to know, you have to be aware, you have to almost stare it down. And then you have to make a choice that you're then going to walk out into the unknown and do something about it. And so you avoid the naivete that comes perhaps from pretending it's not there and just hoping that will change. You have the recognition of the problem, but you have to choose to utilize your own, human spirit to hopefully bring others along the way to then, look forward and work with hope. And I think hope is just the most active thing on the planet, and it's what we all need, and you have to choose to do it. And so it's a privilege, frankly, to be in this moment and to know women like you. There's so many of us all around, right? Yeah. We are more than those who would destroy. We just have to outshine them. So keep shining.
Well, where can people find you? Where can people find MWAG if they want more information?
Yeah, so we're on the internet at mwegmwag.org. We have a really fun Instagram account, MormonWag. And then we have another initiative we didn't even get to talk to that we've built that is actually not Mormon. It's called Women Building Peace. And you can find that on our Instagram. You can find it on we have a website, I think it's just called Women Building Peace. I think it might be .us, not .org, actually. So in that, we're actually, yes, .us, we're actually have campaigns right now. We have a Pen Your Power postcard campaign where you can go on our website and you can order a whole packet of postcards. It comes with a little party packet, like how do you host a party? And the postcards are these really cute postcards. They're all about human dignity. We have one about human dignity. There are these retro. We have one about freedom of speech. We had one about due process. And I think the other one is checks and balances. And you can gather your friends and family together and you write postcards and then you send them to our PO box and then we deliver them for you. So we'll consolidate them with postcards from your state, from other people. And then we kind of, wrap them up in a pretty ribbon and then go to the offices of the elected officials. And then, follow up with them and try to, push forward these principles we've been talking about, directly from their constituents. So that is another fun thing that we invite everyone to participate in.
Oh, that's awesome.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
I'm going to do one of those.
We also did this is our second campaign. Our first campaign was we actually delivered 65 quilts to members of Congress, and every single quilt had 100 plus squares. Each had a message from a constituent around checks and balances and the rule of law. separation of powers. So that you can, if you want a little bit of hope and inspiration, that's really fun to see those messages. And those are on that website and also on our Instagram.
Oh, that's amazing. We will link to those in the show notes so people can find them.
Yep. Please share widely for those of you who joined us and liked the conversation. I wanted to just highlight Marcus's comment in the chat, which is recognizing the humanity in others is where we should all begin. I think that's a really beautiful way to summarize the conversation we just had. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the work that you're doing. It's incredible.
Oh, right back at you.
Absolutely.
Too. Lovely, really wonderful. So we'll keep at it, all of us together.
You've been listening to We Made This Political with Laura Forcum and Lauren Hall. You can find us on Substack, Instagram, or LinkedIn. The podcast Substack is We Made This Political. Laura's Substack is How to Human, and Lauren's Substack is The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life. Subscribe and share if you like what you hear, and please also rate and review on your favorite podcast platform. That really, really helps other people find our work and means a lot to us too. Thanks for listening.